He spent 6 years as the Economist's China bureau chief and continues to produce a column and a podcast for the publication. He's here in Jacksonville ahead of his appearance tonight as part of the World Affairs Council speaker series. David Rennie, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
We're also joined by Britt Hester with the World Affairs Council. Good morning, Britt.
Good morning, Ann.
So, uh, you have spent the last 6 years as bureau chief, David, but you have been at The Economist since 2007. This is your second posting in China. How has that country changed in your time there?
It's changed really in extraordinary ways. I mean, I was first in China in the late 1990s, and that was the pre-Olympics time. The economy, at the time, the Chinese economy was smaller than the economy of the UK, smaller than Britain's. It's now the second largest economy by some measures, catching up on America. Although, there are now headwinds, it's now a really fascinating question whether it will overtake America. But basically, a country of 1.4 billion people, roughly a fifth of the world's population, came back from this artificial isolation where it was so isolated from the world and so poor. And it has become this manufacturing powerhouse, a military powerhouse. And it has also become increasingly assertive and increasingly ideological. And I guess the single biggest change is when I was there in the late 1990s, you could kind of kid yourself that it didn't matter tremendously that it was a country run by a communist party, because all you could see was private business on every corner, everyone trying to get rich, and you could sort of tell yourself that it was just the label that they attached, but that ideology was less and less important. Under the current supreme leader, Xi Jinping, ideology is back, and there is no doubt that you live in a communist party-led country, and that has consequences for the people who live there. It has consequences for the whole world, even narrowly for foreign correspondents trying to do their job there. Everything is changing and becoming a lot more politically controlled and ideologically driven.
In your final farewell column from the Post position, you talked about being a lonely columnist and in the context of world journalists that previously had been staffed there, their numbers coming way down.
Yeah, the numbers are really shocking. So look, I don't want to claim that somehow foreigners, let alone foreign journalists, are somehow special people, that we're like kind of pandas in a zoo, that, you need to have lots of us for a country to be important. So when I said that I was feeling lonely, it was just a way to capture the fact that this is the world's second largest economy. This is America's greatest competitor. This is one of the two great world powers of the 21st century. The number of foreign correspondents, certainly from the US, is just shockingly small. So the simple way to describe it is when I started this most recent posting in 2018, the big US papers, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, between them, they had 27 foreign correspondents based in China. When I left just 3 weeks ago, they had 5. And that's partly because the Chinese threw out a lot of American foreign correspondents in retaliation to the Trump administration, reducing the number of Chinese journalists in the States. It's also because when people left China, it became very difficult to get visas to come back. I mean, even NPR, which has a long tradition of really great China correspondents, is currently down to one out. They used to have 2 great staff correspondents, one in Beijing, one in Shanghai. They now have someone who comes into Shanghai, about half the year, and they cannot get their Beijing correspondent in. That's just dangerous. We can't just live in ignorance of what is happening in this giant country that matters so much.
And of course, I mean, it's not easy to rely on this official story that's coming out of China and through their official channels. But it is important to be doing that kind of work. Also difficult, though. I mean, it seems like it's gotten much harder to be a journalist without surveillance, without interference.
Yeah, and again, I don't want to claim, I'm not going to whine. It's the most privileged job in the world to be a foreign correspondent. You basically get paid to go to fascinating places and talk to interesting people. So if I'm saying it's hard, it's really, what matters is 2 things. Can we do the job? If once you arrive in somewhere like Xinjiang, the far western region where they're repressing Uyghurs and other minorities, it's now essentially impossible to talk to any local people without getting them into so much trouble that it would be irresponsible. So, when you go there, you now have to basically prepare as much of your information before you go and then just try and confirm it visually. Is this mosque demolished? Is that true? Can I see the rubble? Is this mosque padlocked? Are people being forced, to break their fast during Ramadan? Stuff you can visually confirm, because to talk to them would be utterly irresponsible because you're being followed by, a dozen secret policemen who are listening in, who are filming you with phones at all times. But the other big thing that is really hard is that even when you are covering stories that are not about the most sensitive subjects, say there's a factory polluting a river and there's a local environmental group that is trying to just report this using legal channels. Not that long ago, you could talk to those people, you could interview them in the foreign media and talk about the growth of environmentalism in China, and you would not be endangering them. But in the current China of Xi Jinping, there is this sense that the outside world, particularly the West, particularly America, is trying to contain China and hold it down, and that the Western media is somehow an arm of that containment exercise. And the real world consequence is that as a correspondent, you want to talk about the fact that there's an environmental group that is trying to measure water pollution, but you find yourself thinking, is that responsible? Am I going to get them locked up? Are they going to get into a lot of trouble? Because I actually did an environmental story about some people whose job was to survey trash on seashores. And they had like retired people, school kids going out, just like picking up styrofoam, measuring where the trash came from. You would think that would not be national security, but because it was on China's coasts, the Ministry of State Security, their equivalent to the KGB, decided this was espionage, that this was helping foreign powers survey China's coasts. And that NGO got into a huge amount of trouble just for doing that work. So the lines are moving and constraining what we do. So it's not that I think we're special and we should be privileged in some way. It's just that the regular work of trying to explain how China works day to day for ordinary Chinese people, the risks and the consequences are just getting much more severe.
And so, in addition to having to consider whether the people you're asking questions of could be imperiled by that conversation, do you also find that ordinary people are more skeptical of, of Westerners, generally speaking?
It's a mix, and certainly during the pandemic, and I was in China for the entire of the pandemic because our visas got cancelled, and if we left, we couldn't get back in. So I was stuck basically in the kind of this giant bubble of zero COVID China. During the pandemic, there were moments where just being a foreigner would cause kind of panic. People would kind of want to move seats on an aeroplane rather than sit next to you, and you would explain patiently, look, I haven't left China since before the pandemic. I'm just the same as you in kind of virological terms. People would yank their kids out of an elevator when they saw a foreigner in there because, foreigner was panic. That was pretty worrying. The good news is that now the pandemic is in the past, actually a lot of Chinese people are now back to being kind of friendly and curious and hospitable, certainly in very small places. The bad news is that years and years of state media propaganda, particularly about America, the views of like regular ordinary Chinese about America above all, but the West in general, they are getting worse. And so now you're more likely to encounter, people who are hostile, who basically think that, if you're foreign media, you're going to be telling lies about China, or who'll just say things like, oh, I don't know how anyone would go to America. The moment you land at an airport in the States, you're going to get shot in a gun battle, right? Because that's the kind of the propaganda that is just kind of pumped into them. So that is a real noticeable shift.
I want to ask you about COVID. I mean, it sounds like a really intense time to have been living in China during that entire pandemic, but it also affected change on the country. At least our understanding here is that the surveillance state, increased dramatically. Can you talk about whether that is an accurate perception if it continues?
Yeah. And so, the pandemic was really, it was almost a 3-year period. The first 2 years, if you were a Westerner used to kind of Western levels of privacy and sort of anonymity and freedom, it was really shocking. Every building you went into, every train you caught, every station you entered, every shop you entered, you had to scan with your smartphone a QR code to track you in real time. If you happened to be, within 10 minutes and hundreds of yards of someone who was a suspect case, they would come and find you and quarantine you and lock you up, and whether you had no freedom at all on that. The Chinese public, for the first couple of years, they found that strictness annoying and frustrating, but also a comfort. It felt that it was keeping them safe. The very end of the pandemic, the last year of it, went on too long. And so for Chinese people, they felt that ultimately it went on too long and it really crushed the economy. At the end of the pandemic, when it ended very, very suddenly and very, very chaotically at the end of 2022, you're quite right that one of the questions that everyone was asking themselves was, how many of these surveillance techniques, the constant tracking of your movements in real time, will that go away? Because after all, the excuse was that it was for keeping us safe against a virus. Some of it has gone away, but some of it is not. So to give you one single example, Tiananmen Square, very sensitive place, the ceremonial heart of Beijing, clearly where they had the student protests in '89. It was always tight. There were always a lot of cops, a lot of secret police there. During the pandemic, in the name of social distancing, they introduced the system that you had to register in advance 24 hours before you went there to sort of sign in and get your numbers, and they limited the numbers who could go there. That has stayed. So you can no longer just walk into the center of ceremonial Beijing. And that's the access to the Forbidden City, which is next door, the great imperial palace. You now have to register 24 hours ahead of time. And so if your file shows that maybe you petitioned against the government or you had a political difficulty, you are not going to get in. And as a foreigner, it's also much, much harder. As a foreign journalist, even if I was not on reporting duties, just to take friends and family into the Forbidden City, into Tiananmen Square, I need special permission from the propaganda bureau. I can't just walk in. So those kind of controls, in the name of the pandemic, some of them have stayed.
Practically speaking, your devices, how much surveillance do you feel or do you know is happening, of your equipment that you're working with?
So you can certainly see that's in your equipment. And so, for example, one of the greatest challenges of trying to set up an interview with regular Chinese, for example, maybe you're interested in a group who are trying to get paid pension money that was owed them by a local government. They are organizing online. Everyone in China uses a couple of these very, very widely spread programs like Weixin, WeChat. So basically, everyone in China uses the thing WeChat. It's like this super app. It's not just messaging. It's also what you use to shop. It's what you use to kind of talk to friends. That is absolutely the functional equivalent, I used to say to people, of sending me a message on WeChat is like going to the police station, opening the door and shouting your message through the door. Because if you ask for an interview with someone on WeChat, within an hour, the police are hammering on their door where they live and saying, why are you talking to a foreign journalist? Don't see that person, don't talk to them. And so, but the problem is, for an enormous number of ordinary Chinese, that's the only way they have of communicating. And they've kind of made this more or less conscious trade-off that for the convenience of sharing the same system everyone uses, run by a private company, you also understand that there is absolutely no privacy involved in that system. And it is a fantastically effective tool for the Communist Party. And, as a foreign reporter, as soon as you buy an aeroplane ticket to go anywhere, at all sensitive, you land at a provincial airport in the middle of nowhere in China, and you think to yourself as you come out into the arrivals hall, okay, there's a lot of cops. I wonder what's about to happen. And then some guy in plain clothes comes up, flashes a badge and goes, you're from The Economist, what are you doing here? And so, they just track you through the kind of the buying of the ticket. And so you just understand that that's the life you lead. And, actually sometimes it's annoying, when you check into a hotel in a small town, that's when they come and they always report you to the police. And so sometimes, okay, well, if it's a sensitive place, I'll check in really, really late. So you're really tired and you get to the hotel, maybe it's like midnight and you're in the capital of Xinjiang. And then, actually, I can't brush my teeth and go to bed because the cops are going to come. And then you're like, can they just hurry up and get here? Because I need to go to sleep. And then, tum, 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 what are you doing here? There's the cops and stuff. But at least, you're then registered. Then you can hear the crackle of the police radio outside the hotel room door because some poor guy is going to spend the night standing outside your door.
Well, I mean, you describe it as sort of amusing, but it seems like it would be incredibly stressful.
You kind of get used to it. I mean, it's part of the deal.
Yeah. If you're just joining us, we were talking to David Rennie. He works for The Economist. He was their China bureau chief for 6 years. He is now covering geopolitics for the same publication. We're also here with Britt Hester from the World Affairs Council. They are hosting David Rennie tonight as part of their speaker series. So, Britt, for having somebody like David in town, it is a message from abroad. He's coming with this wealth of knowledge about a very different place, but a lot of resonance for residents of Jacksonville still, just with the experiences that he's had.
Yeah. So for us, this is what we do. We bring the world closer, World Affairs Council of Jacksonville. And so these events are intended to bring sort of the stories behind the headlines. So we've had Jane Harmon here back in, at the end of September, David here, and then we've got a whole calendar of different events coming up that are going to be talking about some of these issues that we see. So tonight's event, of course, will be at the University of North Florida with the Adam Herbert University Center at 7 p.m. And we hope that folks will go to our website, worldaffairscounciljax.org, to find those tickets and learn a little bit more about our organization and the way that they can come and participate in these conversations.
David, when you first arrived in Beijing and were meeting with officials there, did you find that there was less skepticism towards you as a reporter, even from an official posture at that time?
So there's clearly been a shift. When I was first working as a journalist in China in the late 1990s, the you know, China was a much less wealthy country, a much less powerful country, and there was almost a sense that, you know, having lots and lots of foreign media there was a kind of tick in the box that China was becoming a really important country. So, sure, they would get annoyed by some of the things you wrote, and they would call you in and they would scold you for some report that they didn't like. But fundamentally, there was a sense that, oh, look, the world media wants to be in China. That's a kind of sign that we're rising. Now, under Xi Jinping, there is a very different view. At a purely kind of pragmatic level, they've realized that every major foreign news organization needs to be in China to think of itself as a serious global news outlet. And that gives the Chinese government leverage by withholding visas, by making it more difficult for the big foreign media, particularly at the moment, the American media, to get in. They have real leverage, and they'll try and extract that. And so, I'm not going to name the news organization, but a very famous world news organization was told, okay, well, we might give one of your journalists a temporary 6-month visa, and we're going to look very, very carefully at what they report, and that will affect whether we give them a permanent visa. And, that kind of fairly blatant, or completely blatant, kind of leverage is something that reflects their kind of growing status. The other thing that has got much more difficult about our relationship with the machine, which in our case is basically usually either the foreign ministry or the propaganda department, is that they have been given explicit instructions by Xi Jinping and the other top leaders of the Communist Party to fight back, to try and win what they call this narrative war. And there's this phrase they use, which is 讲好中国的故事, to tell China's story well. And what that actually means is try and delegitimize and discredit any foreigner suggesting that something is, not perfect in today's China. And so there is a real effort to kind of fight back and argue with us that what we're saying is fake news and that we're picking on, inaccurate stories. And then to bring in, which is the latest thing they're doing, is to bring in foreign influencers and YouTubers and give them these kind of all expenses trips around Xinjiang. And they kind of produce these videos saying, well, I don't see any repression. It seems great to me. Everyone seems happy as, the people I've been talking to are totally happy. Personally, if I found myself interviewing people in a place known for repression in the company of propaganda officials, I might question my life choices, but, that's just me. But it's a thing, and they're very proud of that. And they'll say, you see, you're losing your monopoly. People realize they don't have to just read the New York Times or the Economist. They now have these alternative, much more democratic sources of these people who are much more sincere about being willing to see the good sides of China. So they are really stepping up the kind of the counter propaganda.
And so you're going to be stationed in London, but you've been in the States for a couple of weeks now. What is your impression of how the U.S. or people living here are interpreting or misinterpreting what China represents?
So there's very clearly a shift in opinions of China to people being very skeptical of China, much more suspicious of China. There's no mistaking that. I used to be the Washington bureau chief for 6 years before I was the Beijing bureau chief. And so I've been back the last couple of weeks, mostly in Washington, a bit in New York, certainly up in Congress, talking to people, either senators or staffers or people who work in, government positions. There is very clearly a focus on China as a challenger and really as an adversary that is, even further advanced than it was even when I was last here 6 months ago or, a year ago. I try and come every 6 months. And this new job as geopolitics editor, writing a new column about geopolitics, I'm going to be based in London, I think. Frankly, I'm going to be living on a plane, and I'm going to spend a lot of time in the States. And I guess the thing that slightly concerns me about some of the China debate that I hear in the States, and this is not to criticize the States, because frankly, the debate in the UK or in Europe is not much more advanced, is that sometimes it sounds like your two choices are kind of panic. China has a plan to take over the world and is about to take over the world, or complacency. China is making so many mistakes that it's about to do us the favor of defeating itself and kind of slowing down so much we don't have to worry about it. And I would kind of normally try and aim my efforts somewhere between those two poles of panic and complacency. China is an unprecedented challenge, an unprecedented competitor. The competition is here, it's real. Both sides, I think, understand that it's a competition for primacy in a whole bunch of spheres: economic, political, diplomatic, and also military. And that is a very serious thing. But we need to focus on, pick our battles, not try and panic about everything. Not everything that comes out of China is a threat to national security. And we have to be smart about competing. We, the West, have to be smart about competing with China. And so, it seems to me that the debate is clearly very focused on China, but we need to be slightly more rigorous about, making sure we don't try and panic about everything to do with China.
David Rennie, he's speaking on China and its place in the world tonight at 7 o'clock at the UNF Herbert Center as part of the World Affairs Council Speakers Series. The event is free. It's open to the public, and it will no doubt be fascinating. David Rennie, thanks so much for being here. Britt Hester, appreciate both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anne.